Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the next video in the exception handling scenario series with UiPath Studio. This is the third video series and today we are going to discuss about throw versus rethrow. Before we directly jump into the agenda for this video, let us have a quick recap and see what we have covered in the first and the second video. The first video in this series was Introduction to the Exception Handling, where we have seen why it is important, how do we differentiate system and business exception, what are the scenarios of business exception, and what are the various activities which are available to do the exception handling. Post that, there was a video. The title was Try, Catch and Finally. What we did in that video, we created a scenario to explain the try catch with the help of example and a demo. We have seen how does a multiple catch block work in UiPath Studio, what is the importance of system.exception, and what is finally block, when to use it, how to use it. So this all we have done in the previous two videos. In case you are new to the channel and directly looking at this video and try to understand the exception handling, I request you to go and watch the video 1 and the video 2. I'll put the links in the descriptions and you can refer that. Okay, so coming back to the agenda for this video. Today, the same thing, we are again going to create a scenario. We are going to have a kind of a real-time scenario and we are going to discuss the throw versus rethrow activity. We'll start the video by looking at the throw activity, when to use it, how to use it. Post that, we are going to see how exactly the rethrow activity works, what is the context when it is used. We will try to see this with the help of a real-time example. When we are using the throw and the rethrow activity, there are certain things you need to take care of. All those we are going to explain in a step-by-step manner, and everything of this we are going to cover with a demonstration in UiPath Studio. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so now let's discuss about throw and rethrow. Before we directly jump into throw and rethrow, let us have a quick recap that why exception handling is important. Okay, so this is what I have explained in the previous video, so I am just going up a little bit fast. In case you haven't watched the videos, I'll put the link in the descriptions and you can refer that. So what happens and why it is important? So this will give us a background to start with the throw and the rethrow. Okay, so I have a project. This blue block which you are looking on the screen is a complete project. Okay, my project has separate pieces of code. Now let's say what happened is that some piece of the code has error. Okay, it has got some exception or it has got some error. Now, if there is no exception handling done on the project, what would happen? The exception would occur and the entire project will fail. Your other pieces of code also will not execute. That is why exceptional handling is important in the projects. Now, how do I do the exceptional handling? In the previous videos, we have seen that we use the try and the catch activity. Now let us see if I implement the try and catch in an exception handling, what happens. Okay, again I have the same project. I have multiple pieces of code, and if some of the code is breaking, now all I have to do is I have to handle this exception. So when I say exception handling, I means that I have to encapsulate this code in the help of a try and a catch block. Okay, so whichever code I feel might generate an exception is encapsulated in a try catch block. Now what happens is that this code exceptional handling is done, so it does not impact the other pieces of the code and your project still continues to run perfect. Okay, so that is why we have to do the exceptional handling. Okay, and we have seen that how exceptional handling is done. It is done with the help of the try catch and the finally block. Okay, So now we are going to talk about the throw activity. Before I come to this definition and all this PPT, let me just go back to my UiPath Studio, and I want to show you the scenario on which it would be helpful so that we are able to understand the slides. Okay. So I am in my UiPath Studio. I have just created a sequence. Let me go here and I will create a new sequence, and today we are going to use an activity which is called the throw activity. I'll hit create. Okay, so I have created a blank sequence in UiPath Studio. Now let me go to my folder structure. So this is in my E drive in some UiPath content. I have a folder of, let's say, exception handling UiPath, and I have a data file which the bot is supposed to read in the automation. Okay, so I'll just repeat. I have a data file, data.xlsx file, which the robot is supposed to use in the automation. And what is there in the file? This is all the data which is available, and this data is available in sheet 1. Okay, data.xlsx. Now let us try to see and apply some exception handling. Okay, so first of all, it's an Excel. So which activity I use? I will use the Excel application scope to read that Excel. Okay, so I'll go here and I use Excel application scope. Now Excel application scope will ask me, tell me where the file is located. Okay, so I'll go here, click on this button, go to the path, which is this one, and it will say that you have to read data.xlsx and hit open. Now to know more about the Excel automation and all of these activities, I have a dedicated playlist on the Excel automation. You can refer that. Okay. Now to read a particular sheet in this one, I have to use an activity which is called a read range, right? So I will just go here and say read range. Now read range, since we are in the Excel application scope, I am going to use this one. Okay. And it will ask me the sheet name. The sheet name for me is sheet 1, so it remains unchanged. And the output I am going to store in a data table. Hit Control plus K, that is the shortcut, and create a data table called dt underscore data. Okay, now read range is successful. The next task which I have to do is just, let's say I want to print that how many rows of data are available. Okay, so how can I do that? I will just go to the activities, go here and take a write line activity. In this write line activity, all I have to do is dt data dot rows dot count, okay, dot toString. Now this is a simple workflow where we are telling UiPath to just read this Excel and count the number of rows and give us the count. Let me close this Excel, go back to my UiPath Studio, go here and select run the file. Okay. Now what would happen? The robot will execute, it will read the Excel file and give me the count. Okay, so let us just wait for the automation. Okay, I can see the robot being fired up, it has opened, and this write line will print the output, and I can see that there are some close to 26 lines of data. That means my Excel, the robot is able to handle. Okay, now when my UiPath robot is able to read this Excel, which is data.xlsx, and we have just seen that it is able to print the data also. Okay, now just let's open the Excel and see what data is available. Okay, so this data is, let's say, some of the transactional data, and I can see that I have some details available here. Now think that you are automating this for a business and you have a condition which says, which is highlighted in red here, that the transaction amount should not exceed a 10,000. Okay, so you have a requirement in your process where once you read the Excel is available, UiPath is able to read it, and you have the data with you. You have to check that this transactional amount, which is 5,000 as of now, it should not exceed 10,000. If it is exceeding 10,000, then you have to inform the business, or you have to inform someone that yes, today the transactional amount has exceeded 10,000. Okay, as of now the transaction amount is 5,000. That means the robot should continue, and if the transaction amount is exceeding 10,000, we have to inform the business. Let us try to implement this and see how exactly the throw will come in this picture. Okay, so now if I have to check that what is the value, so if you can see here, this value is available in the cell F7. Okay, so how do I read a cell? To read the cell, we use an activity which is called the read cell. Okay, I have explained all of this activity in a detailed video in the other my Excel playlist, so I would request you to refer that in case you want to know more about these activities. Okay, so read cell basically will ask you, tell me which sheet you want to read. So for me, the sheet is sheet 1 and the cell which I want to read is F7. How do I know? I just click on the 5000 and I see that it is F7. Okay, I go back to UiPath Studio and I just change this from A1 to, I change it to F7. Done, right? Now if I go to the properties, you can see that it is expecting that where exactly should I store the value. Now if I go to the Excel, I can see that this is some integer and 0.00, that means this is a double value, right? So I will just hit Ctrl plus K and I will create a double variable called, let's say, dbl underscore value. Okay, now this will automatically create a variable for me, but the by default it will create string, but I have seen that this value is a double, so I'll just change this data type from string to system dot double. Okay, now what would happen is UiPath would read this cell and I just want to print that whatever value is here, I just say a right line, I say value from Excel is which variable, it is in dbl value dot to string. So I just want to print it what exactly we are getting. Okay, now we have got this 5000 in a variable called dbl value. Now we have to validate a condition that, if you remember the condition, if the amount should not be 10,000. Okay, so I'll just take a if condition because we have to compare, right? So what is the condition? The condition is that whatever value that is in this value, if it is less than 10,000, okay, then what you have to do is you have to continue the process, right? So let's say this, I will just use a right line, but in the real-time automation, let's say you have to do this thing, so you have to continue this automation, and in case if it is happening, you have to inform the business. Okay, now let us try to save everything and I will just close this Excel as well, and let us try to see if it is working or not. Okay, I'll go here and I say run the file. Okay, so the robot is executing, and if I go to the output, let us see. So 26 rows of the data, which is the data table count, the value which we got was 5000 and it has told me continue because that value was in the Excel, we have seen it was 5000. Now let's say someday what happened is this value now changes from 5000 to 15,000 now. Okay, so this value has now changed from 5000 to 15,000, and now as per your automation you have to inform the business, right? So let us see if it is going to this block or not. Okay, so I'll go here and I say run the file. Okay, again the same thing will happen, it will try or read the Excel F7, and in the output I can see it says inform the business, right? So now just think of this thing that as of now I have just used the right line activity, but in the real time scenario you have to tell the business that you have got a exception, right? That means here you have got a business exception. So business has given you a condition that has failed, and now you have to inform the business that there is an exception. But this right line would not suffice, right? I would have to stop the process here only, right? So that the other activities which are following it, so let's say there are other set of activities, I will just use a right line activity and here I say these are the next activities, right? So let's say these are the other set of activities, but as of now if I just go and select run the file, what is happening, if you will see and analyze the flow, that it is going reading 15,000, it says inform the business, and the next activities are also getting executed. That means UiPath is executing the next set of activities. Now how do I stop my robot at this point and I tell that do not execute this and also throw a business exception? Okay, so in the previous video we have tried to differentiate between the system and the business exception. So this what is generated is called a business exception. Okay, now this is the point where the throw activity will come in picture. Okay, so that means now this is a kind of exception. This is not a null reference exception, this is not a IO exception. So if you think from a code point of view, so there is no coding error, right? There is no syntax error, there is no coding error, there is no null reference, but still this is a kind of exception. So how can we throw a exception ourselves in certain scenarios? So that is where you would use a throw activity, because an exception has occurred and I have to explicitly throw an exception. So what you have to do is you have to create an exception object and throw it. Okay, let us see how we can do it. So in the inform the business block, when it is this, all I have to do is I have to use an activity which is called throw. It would be available the same place where you have the try catch, workflow, error handling and the throw. Okay, so I'll just drag and drop this throw activity here. Now throw activity will ask, tell me what do you want to throw. Okay, so now let me just park this and go back to my slide. Now what is throw? Throw is for generating your own exception on the top of generated by UiPath. So UiPath generates a lot of exception: system exception, integer not found, cannot convert from string to integer, null reference exception, selector not found exception, and n kind of exception, right? But if I want to generate my own kind of exception with some details which I want to give, I would have to use this throw activity. Second point is important, which says that mostly it will be used to generate the business rule exception, which is just we have seen. And lastly, you must first instantiate the new exception. That means you would have to create an object of the exception. So if you will just go back to the automation, as of now there is no exception which is generated, right? So what UiPath, how would the catch block know that what exceptions are there? Okay, so for that we have to, since we are generating a new exception, that means I would have to use the keyword new. Okay, so now I have to go to the throw, I'll click on the property. It has only one property which is called exception. Okay, if I just click here, since this is a new exception which I am generating myself, so I would have to write new, put a space. Now it is asking me what type of exception you want to throw. So I am throwing a business rule exception. Okay, so I am telling UiPath that this is a new exception which I am throwing. The exception type is business rule exception, and in the bracket I would have to tell that what is the message you want to give with this exception. Okay, so the message which I want to give in this exception is that the threshold, threshold, threshold value of transaction exceeds, okay, 10,000, right? So that means I am telling that we have breached the value and that is why we have throwing this exception. I'll hit OK. Now as soon as you throw this exception, all the activities which are after this would not execute. Okay, this activity will not execute because you are throwing the exception here. Good practice, always go and rename the activity that throw a 10,000 exception. Okay, so that means you can know that yes, this block throws that 10k check exception. Okay, now as of now if you notice that this is the flow, it is 10,000, it will come here and it will throw the exception. Now in the previous run when this throw was not there, what we have noticed that it was executing the next activities. Okay, now let us see how the execution behave. So what I will do is, let me just go here and put a breakpoint and we will just try to run it in a debug mode and see what exactly is happening. Okay, so the process will execute, still the value is 15,000 in the Excel, we are comparing. Okay, now if you will see, it has the value we have got in the output. We have just printed, right? So you can always refer the value in the output pan like this. The value from the Excel is 15,000. Okay, let me try to click on the step into here, which says it will execute one by one. Now the value is, condition is false, that means it has come to the exception block. It says inform to the business. Okay, so this information now has been done with the help of, let's say, email sent. Now we want to stop the process. Now as soon as I throw this exception, see what happens. Okay, so now it has thrown the exception, and if you will see the details, this is the detail which I have written, right? That threshold value of the transaction has exceeded 10,000. And if I click on step into, step into, step into, and if you will see, it has not executed the next set of activities, right? And why this execution error is giving, so most of you would have realized that why this error is coming as a pop-up, right? Because we have not done the exception handling here, right? As of now we are just throwing a business exception, right? If you go to the output, you can see that we are throwing a business exception, right? See this throw, and the exception type is business rule exception. So in the previous video we have seen that how we read this, so you can refer that video. So as of now I'll just tell you that we are just throwing the business rule exception, and it has abruptly stopped the execution. That means the other piece of automation are not working, right? Now throw activity is used to explicitly throw an exception. Now assuming that you want to do and continue the next set of operation, not this one but let's say the other activities. Okay, so how do we do it? So for that, all you have to do is, how do I do the exceptional handling? So if you remember, in the exceptional handling, whichever block I feel might throw an exception, we encapsulate that thing in a try catch block, right? So now let's say my this entire application scope I want to encapsulate in a try catch block. Okay, now in the catch it will ask me what kind of exception you might get, right? So I know here that I have thrown a exception, which is what kind of exception? The exception type is business rule exception. That means in my catch block I should have a section of business rule exception. Okay, so I have two options now. Either I can put the business rule exception, or if I don't want to put, I can put the system exception, and this guy, since this is the parent, will handle all the exception. This is also what we have seen in the previous video, but as a good practice it is always good to handle the business exception separately. Okay, so as of now I know that my block is going to send me a business exception. So I will go here, I'll click on browse for properties, and I will search here business rule exception and hit OK. Now UiPath will ask, okay, in the try block, whenever a business rule exception is coming, that means it will come at this point, right? It will throw this exception, and as soon as it throw, that means somebody should catch it, right? And who is that somebody? That somebody is this guy, business rule exception. Now what do you want to do here? So let me just again go here and print a single write line statement. Again, you can have a own set of logic of exceptional handling, where you maybe try to reach out to the business, you send an email, you restart some application, you can do anything in this block. But as of now, let me just say that exception is handled, okay, in the business exception block. Okay, now I save, and now if I just go here and I say run the file. Okay, now let us see what happens. Okay, so the execution is completed. If I go to the output, the value was 15,000, inform the business, and the exception was handled in the business exception block. That means now the program is not stopping abruptly as we have seen last time, right? Because if I just remove the exception handling, the program stops abruptly. That is the same concept which we did in the last videos, so you can again refer that. So if you do not do the exception handling, your process terminate and it crashes the entire program. But when I do the exception handling, it closes the exception, handles the exception gracefully. But now what happens if I just put one more here which says exception, okay, and I just remove the business exception block. Okay, I will just delete this business exception block, and I have just put one exception here, and let's say I write here exception block. Okay, now again it is the same concept. System.exception is the parent of all the exceptions. So even if you throw a business exception from here, so business core dot exception, business rule exception is again a child of this guy. So here first it will check either do I have a block of business exception, it will say no. So now it will go and again print this block only, it will not be handled by the exception block. So I'll go here and I say run the file. The robot is executing, and if I go to the output, I can see that value was this, inform the business, and the exception block, this is exception handled by the exceptional block. But as soon as I put a business exception block, so this is the same thing, the same concept. If I have the business exception block available, that means control C, and I will just paste it here, and I say that this is the business exception block. Now what happens, try will throw a business exception, it will check in the catch, do I have the business exception block? If yes, this block will handle, if no, then this block will handle, right? So as of now I have this handle here and I have the parent also, but the child is matching, so I'll just go here and let's see what happens. Run the file. Okay, so now what would happen is that the exception would now be handled by the specific one, that is the business rule exception. So value for us 15,000, inform the business, and it was handled by the exception block. Okay, so that is how the throw activity works. Okay, so I will just repeat, the throw activity is used to throw a custom exception whenever you want to generate a new exception, mostly used to generate a business exception, but this is not only restricted to business exception. Okay, you can always use a throw activity to throw any kind of exception. For example, let's say once the sheet is read, I want to throw let's say a selector not found exception. So all you have to do is go here and say new selector not found exception, and you can say that selector was not found. Okay, this also works, right? So it is not only restricted, but most of the times you would use it to throw the business exception, but you can also use it to throw any exception, double, integer not found, null, reference exception, everything which are inside the exception parent exception, all these things you can throw from here. So basically whatever you are getting in this drop down, all these kind of exceptions can be thrown with the help of the throw activity. But the benefit is that you can always use your own message here, right, with the exception object, right? So when you are debugging or anything, it helps, right? Now I have just thrown a which exception I have thrown, a selector not found exception. There is selector not found is not available here. Now let's see what happens. Okay, I'll try to show it in a debug mode. I'll put a breakpoint here, and now let us see what happens, right? So it is throwing an exception. That means we are telling UiPath that I don't want to execute the other set of activities. So sheet 1 it will read, and then it will throw a selector not found exception. Now as soon as an exception is encountered, since we are in the try catch block, it will not stop the execution, it will throw that exception to the catch block. Okay, it will go to the catch block, and in the catch block it is handled by the exception because the selector not found block exception is not there. So this is the parent, it says that I will handle everything, and I hit continue. So if you will see in the output, you have got the no logs, right? It didn't even printed that count also, because the count statement print is after this one. So as soon as you use the throw activity, all the below activities, whatever automation you have written after it, it would not execute. Now just think of a scenario that you are using automation where you have to log in and the user ID and the password are not correct. Now do you want to continue the automation? The answer would be no. So in that case, you can simply use an activity. Let's say here you have validated that the user ID and the password is not correct. You and the robot inserted the user ID and the password. You got a message saying that the credentials are incorrect. Now in that case, what you can do is you can simply, let's say this is the block and you want to throw a business exception. So all you have to do is new business rule exception and you just say here that the credentials are incorrect. That's it. Now the robot will not execute any step which are coming after that throw activity, right? So now I hope you understand what is throw, how to use it and where to use it. Okay, so let me just repeat. Throw is for generating your own exception on the top of what is generated by UiPath. So most of the system exception would be generated by UiPath. You are not only restricted to generate the business rule exception, you can generate any kind of exception with the throw. Okay, but it is always advisable to use with the try catch block, because that way your program will not stop abruptly and you should be able to handle the exception gracefully. The other thing is, whenever you are using the throw activity, you must first instantiate the new exception. That means you would have to use the new keyword, because you are generating that exception. So that way you have to create the object of that exception. So that's why we use the exception, the new one. So that is why we use this word which is called new, and then we type the exception and what is the message in the exception. So this is the benefit and this is how you use the throw activity. Okay, so now that we have seen how exactly a throw activity works and when should we use it, I hope now you got a clear idea of using the throw activity. Let us now try to understand what exactly is a rethrow activity, what are the scenarios we would be using the rethrow activity, and how do we use the same in UiPath Studio. Okay, so let me go back to my presentation. Rethrow activity will be used in a context where the exception which is generated is rethrown using the try catch activity. Okay, this might not make sense to as of you now, but trust me, after watching the example you would be able to understand. But as of now, just understand that rethrow can be only used within a catch block. Okay, and rethrow, what actually rethrow does, if you just look at the word rethrow, so whatever exception your code has thrown, you are just rethrowing the exception. Okay, now let us see how does it works, and let us go back to UiPath Studio and try to analyze it. I am back in my UiPath Studio. So this was an automation we have just written where we are reading an Excel sheet which is data.xlsx. In this Excel we have this amount 15,000 and we have written an automation just now that if the amount is exceeding 10,000 we have to generate a business exception. Let me close this. I'll go back to UiPath Studio. I'll go here and I say run the file. Right. So this is just to show you what exactly we have done as of now using the throw activity. And the automation has completed. So we have got 15,000. It has informed the business and it has thrown a business exception. And how do I got this business exception? We have used the throw activity here, and this guy is sending me this business rule exception. We have encapsulated this code in a try catch block and we are able to handle here, right? So this is what we have just now seen. Now let's say this XAML or this piece of automation is a part of a big automation or a big project. Whenever you start any project in UiPath Studio, there is something which is called main.xaml, and this guy is supposed to be the entry point of any automation. So whenever we run any automation in UiPath Studio, this is the first XAML which get executed. So that is why when we go here and I say run, it runs the program from the main.xaml. You always has an option to have more than one entry point, but always it start from main.xaml. Okay. Now let's say this is my big automation. As of now, I do not have any activity in main.xaml. Let me just drag and drop a write line activity. Okay. Assuming that this is an automation which we have already written in the main.xaml. So I say here I am from main.xaml automation. Okay, so you have written some piece of code in main.xaml. As of now, it is just a write line, but it can be any complex logic, right? I'll go to the sequence, I rename it to the main. Best practice, right? So some automation is already done in the main.xaml. Now our part which we have done just now, the Excel thing, that is handled and done everything in this XAML, which is called through activity. Now if I want to invoke the same code from here, what do? I go to the project, I drag and drop the through activity here. So let's say this is one automation, this is second automation, and then you have more automation in the main.xaml. Okay, so let's say the more automation what you have written is, I will just use the same thing, more automation from main.xaml, right? Now if you see, this is my complete, let's say, project where I have some automation code in main.xaml. Then I am using this XAML where I have used the throw activity, exception handled, and then we have more automation in main.xaml. Now just think this is your complete project. And now I am going to explain you what exactly is a Rethrow activity. So if you will just look at this XAML, what do you see? This XAML is a child and this main is the parent. Okay, how do I know? Because main is invoking this XAML, right? So I have something which is called main.xaml, right? And I have one workflow which is called the throw activity.xaml. So if I ask you guys which one is the parent and which one is the child, we can clearly see that main is invoking this workflow. That means this workflow is invoked by the main, right? So that is coming inside the main.xaml like this, right? So that is why this becomes the child and this becomes the parent. Okay, so it is important to understand the parent child relationship of the XAML. So this is the parent and this is the child. This is the parent main and this is the child. Now why exactly I am giving you the context of parent and child and why Rethrow will come in picture? Let me just go back to my presentation and I want to explain you the Rethrow. Okay, so assuming that this red color code, this entire thing is the parent code and this is the main.xaml. Okay, in the main.xaml I have invoked certain pieces of code, one child code, another invoke code, another invoke code, and more invoke code. Because when I use separate XAMLs, when I invoke separate XAMLs in the main.xaml, that is where I am creating the entire automation. So now the same thing, the same way I have this one automation block, two automation block, three automation block. Similarly, this is the red block, the parent code main.xaml, and it is invoking certain invoke code. Now let's say one of the child code got an exception. It has generated and got some exception, be it a system exception, be it a business rule exception, null reference exception, any kind of exception. So if exception handling is not done, what happens? That we have just seen in the previous videos, that the entire code breaks. It breaks my child workflows as well as it breaks the main.xaml workflow also, right? So that is the basics of exception handling. Now let's say I have already handled this exception in the try catch, right? So what I would have do, I would have handled this exception in this child workflow with the help of the try catch block, right? So that means if I just go back to my UiPath automation, this was one XAML, here it was getting some exception, and since I have handled the exception, the other pieces of the code, this guy, this guy, this guy, invoke code, the lower three would not impact. Okay, now here it is important to understand that what you have done in the catch section. I have handled the exception in the try section. In the catch section, I have handled the exception. That means whatever exception it was thrown from this, I have told UiPath that you don't need to throw this exception. This exception is handled. That means this exception is taken care in the catch block. Okay, so UiPath will say, okay, if you have taken care of the exception, no worries. Okay, so if I go to the main workflow and if I try to run this entire file now, if I just go here and I say run the file, now let us see what happens. We'll go back to the code, and if you will see here, first we main automation was executed, then this all automation from the XAML was executed, we got a business exception, and then it was handled inside the here, right, inside the throw one. So this was the child, here we have handled it. So let me just go here in the throw activity. If you see, we have handled it and we have seen that business exception block. Let me just go here and say business exception block handled. So that way we would be able to understand that what is happening. Let me go to main and I just go here and I say again I rerun the automation. Okay, so now let us just wait for the execution to fire up. This is important to understand, that's why I am reiterating everything. If I go to the output, you can see first the main.xaml automation was executed, right? This guy was executed. Then we have this automation, all this coming from this XAML. Here we have gotten business exception. So the business exception was handled here. And then since the business exception was handled, my other code, which is the more automation from main.xaml, was able to execute. But in case if you do not handle this exception, what would happen? It will break the entire automation, because we have seen that in the previous scenarios, right? Coming back to our example. So now it entirely depends that how you have handled. So let's say in the catch section you have handled. Okay, so as of now in this catch section, if you see, we have handled the exception. So that means my other pieces of automation are working fine. But you always has an option to rethrow the exception from the catch block. Okay, so let's say there is a situation which the child code is not able to handle. There is an exception which has occurred. Okay, now the child block think that if it can handle the exception, it will handle the way we have just done here, and main does not bother what exception came. But let's say in some scenarios what happens, that the child code is not able to handle the exception. In that case, the child code has always an option to use the rethrow activity. So rethrow activity simply means that whatever exception I have got, I am just rethrowing it. So when there is an exception, I am rethrowing, that means somebody would have to catch it, right? And who is that somebody? Whoever is the parent who invokes this XAML has to handle this exception. Okay, I'll just repeat. Whenever you use a rethrow activity inside any of the code, whosoever is invoking this XAML, that means whosoever is the parent, will have to handle this exception, right? So it has to be handled by the parent.xaml. Let us try to implement the same thing in UiPath Studio. Now I'll go back here and let's say I have got this business exception. As of now I was able to handle it, so business exception block was handled. So now let's say there is some kind of exception which the child is not able to handle, and so I just write here that business exception block, and I will just write that child not able to handle. So this is the child, it is not able to handle. Now what would the child do? So the child says that I am not able to handle. Dear parent, you just handle this. As soon as you use the drag and drop this activity here, that means you are just rethrowing the exception. So the child exception, it has got some business exception here, it got the read everything, and then whenever this is reaching the exception block, we are just saying rethrow. Rethrow activity does not have any property. It simply catches the exception which you get from the try block, and it send it exception to the bubble this exception up to the parent XAML. And which is the parent XAML? The parent XAML is main.xaml. Okay, now let us see what happens. Okay, if I just save everything, and now this time I would try to run this workflow in a debug mode. Okay, and let us try to see what happens. Debug the file. Now what would happen? First thing, the main XAML would work. It will come here, it will execute this line. Next, it will try to invoke this XAML. It will go here, it will try to read the Excel, right? Inside the Excel, we have intentionally put a business exception, right? It will read the sheet data. The sheet data is 15,000. It says inform the business, and it throws a business exception. Now this child is throwing a business exception. That means it will go to the catch. Okay, it has thrown the exception. If you will notice here, exception thrown, it will go to the catch section of the throw activity. So this is the child now. It will go to the child. In the child, previously we were able to handle it. So we were able to successfully execute the other activities, this activity. But now this time, business exception block is, let's say, not able to handle. So the child says that I am just rethrowing the exception. As soon as you rethrow this exception, it will come to the parent. So it has come to the parent, and now it is the responsibility of the parent to handle that exception. But now, since I have not done any exception handling in the main, my program got crashed with a exception, that is the threshold transaction exceed 10,000. This is the message which we have thrown, right? Whenever you are throwing any exception to the parent like this, make sure that it has to be handled by the parent or the XAML which is calling. If you are not doing, your automation crashes, we have just seen, right? If I just go to the main, if I try to run it now, I'll just remove this debugger and I just go here and I say run it. Now I have no exception handling. This block, this child block is throwing an exception. There is no exception handling in the main. I just go here and I say run. Now what happens? It will just go and it will abruptly stop the process, right? It has read and it has thrown this exception because there is no exception handling in the main. So what happened here? This guy, this child workflows told that, hey parent, there is an exception I am not able to handle and I am throwing the exception to you. Now the parent code was supposed to handle that exception. That means we should have a try catch block in the parent also, and we didn't have the try catch block. That's why the automation break. Now to fix this, what I would do, I would just encapsulate the main also in the try catch block, right? I have encapsulated the main. Now here I know that there is a business exception, but always, right, you know that we have a business rule exception. So I go here, browse for type, I just go here, business rule exception, I select here, and then I just add one more block. I hope now you understand why I am using system.exception here, because this guy is the parent of all the exception. We have explained all of this in the first video. If you have not watched that, I would request you to watch, then only you would be able to understand. So now we have done the exception handling in the parent also, and whenever there is a business rule exception, I say that I use a write line activity. Let's say that this is handled. Okay, let's say that I just write here that the business exception is handled by main. Okay, and in case there is a system exception or any exception, I just say, because it will handle all the exception, I just say all exception is handled by the main. So now if you see here, now this code is outside, right, and this code is here. So whichever automation piece was throwing an error. So in my previous automation, I have this write line, main dot automation. I have this automation, more automation in this one, and the block, which block? This block was supposed throwing me an error. Previously, I did not have the exceptional handling, so my automation was crashing, and my this more automation in the main.xml was not handled. Now this activity is rethrowing the exception. Now let us try to run it again and see how exactly handling the exception in the main has resolved this issue. I'll go here, I'll again select debug. Okay. First it will go to the output, it will say that yes, main.xaml is executing. I'll go to the output, let me just pin this output. Okay. Main.xaml is executing, it will go inside the child. The child will again try to open the Excel, right? So that is what we have done in the try block. Inside the child one, we are saying that it is going to throw an business exception. The exception is already handled, so it goes to the catch block of the child. In the catch block, we say that child is not able to handle, so now we are rethrowing the exception. Now who would handle it? If I just rethrow it, it would be rethrown to the parent. Who is the parent? The parent is the main.xaml. So I just rethrow it, and this exception is now bubbled up to main.xaml. Now here, previously this activity was not encapsulated in try catch block. That means we have not used the exceptional handling here, so the program was stopping, right? Now if I just go here and click on step into, since I have already done the exceptional handling in main also, now this exception would be handled by main, and if you can see, I got that business exception is now handled by the main. And now the other piece of automation, which is more automation in main.xml, is getting executed. Okay, and this completes the complete execution. So that means if I go to the output, so what has happened, if you just analyze the output now, we have got the main automation, we have got this exception from the threshold value exception from the child was not able to handle, the child rethrow the exception. Now since it rethrow, it was taken care by the parent. Inside the parent handle it, and some more automation which was there in the parent was able to execute. But now it is important for you to always remember, whenever you are rethrowing, you just have to take care of the exception. Who is the calling one, who is the parent should handle. Now a question comes here, that what happens if this rethrows this exception? What happens if I rethrow this exception from main.xaml? Main.xaml is not having any parent, right? It is not having any parent. Let me try to use a rethrow activity and let us see what happens. Most of you would have guessed it correctly. Let me just put a rethrow activity. So what is happening here? We have a main.automation. This is the parent. This is one workflow. This workflow is rethrowing the exception. In the main workflow, I say that okay, main workflow is handled, but let's say sometime what happens, that if I go to the property and I say that business exception is, or I say that main is also not able to handle, main is also not able to handle, and what happens, that main will just rethrow this exception. But now where this rethrow will go? There is no one who is invoking main. Now in this case, what happens, your entire process will stop. Let me go here and I say run. Okay, now let us just wait for the execution to complete. Okay, and if you will see, we have gotten runtime exception error. If you go to the output, just see what happened. First main.xaml automation was executed. That means if I just go here, this block was executed, we got this thing in output. We have thrown a business exception from the child, right? It was a rethrow, right? The child threw an exception and it was supposed to be handled by the parent, but since parent also was not able to handle, so it got says that main is also not able to handle, so it thrown the business exception and the program has stopped. That means in the orchestrator, the status of this job would be faulted. Okay, you would not get any exception, anything. So that's why it is important to understand that the parent should be able to handle all kind of exceptions. Okay, so that is about the rethrow activity. Let me just go back to the PPT, and I hope now you understand this XAML. I'll just quickly give a recap what exactly is happening. Let's say you have an automation piece. Let's say this is the parent code main.xaml. You invoke certain automation. Any of the child code, if it is throwing a business exception, right? So if it is handled, first of all, the exception should be handled. Then only you should be able to rethrow it. Just think, if you are not having any try catch block, what will you throw if you do not have any exception? So if the exception is handled and you handle it, well and good. If you are not able to handle it, you always has an option to rethrow that exception, and as soon as you rethrow it, it goes to the parent. Now it is the responsibility of the parent to handle that exception. If it is handled by the parent, well and good, but if the parent is also not handle it, then your program will stop. So it is important that your parent should handle all kind of exception. Okay, now coming back to my slide, and I just want to show you one more thing before I just go through this one about the rethrow activity. That now you just read this presentation, what it says. Rethrow actually throws a previously thrown exception within a try catch block. The error is rethrown retaining the original source of the exception. That means whenever we rethrow, we simply mean that we are catching the exception and rethrowing it to the parent. Okay, the second point is important. Rethrow can be only used within the catch block of the try catch. This I will show you via demonstration. Third one, rethrow actually takes the existing exception, regenerates it so that it can be catched by a higher level try catch. So in our case, the higher level try catch was the main try catch. Okay, now when we say rethrow can be only used in a catch block, why that is so? If I go to one of the XAML, let's say this one, right? This is already having this try catch block. We are telling UiPath, you try to catch this exception. Whatever exception you get, you catch here and you rethrow it. So now just think, if you do not have any exception, what you are going to rethrow. So even if I just try to pull a rethrow activity anywhere in the program, you will get an error saying that rethrow activity will be only coming in the catch part, because that is the place where UiPath will catch the exception and rethrow. If you do not have any exception, what would you rethrow? Other activity was throw, that you can always use outside the try catch anywhere, right? Because this activity you use the new keyword and you are creating the exception. But rethrow activity, as we have seen now, it is just used to throw the exception which has been already created. So in the try block, we got this business exception. Now this business exception object has got some data. It has got that exception object. Now that exception object, we are just rethrowing it. So that's why the name is rethrow, and it will only come in the context of the catch. You cannot use rethrow anywhere apart from the catch block. Okay, so that was about throw and the rethrow. Now an assignment to you guys, if you are looking at this video and till here, now what you have to do is you have to create a small automation on your machine and just try to experiment with try, catch, throw and rethrow. Okay, if you are able to understand it, that would be very super good, because that is the main thing which we require whenever we doing any real-time automation. Exceptional handling is a must, and the best way to do it is to make small automation like I have done. Always try to run the automation step by step manner. If you are able to understand it once, it will be set for the entire lifetime and you don't have to revisit. So make sure whenever you are studying anything, not only exceptional handling but anything, just try to make a small program, Try to run it in a debug mode, see where the flow is going, and then it will clear all your concept. I hope with this video you are able to understand the concept of throw versus rethrow, how does it work, when to work, and how to use it in your automations. Okay, so that was all for this video. I like to wrap this video here. I hope now you are clear about the throw versus rethrow activity. How do you use it? When to use it? What are the things that you need to take care? Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do subscribe to the channel and happy automation.